Thanks, Stephanie. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. This is the third webinar in a series of three. We talked a little bit in the first webinar about why you might want to use multiple choice questions for formative assessment. In the second webinar, we talked a bit about how to draft high quality questions in the multiple choice format. And now we're going to talk a little bit about a number of variations that have been used and some that have not been very successfully used by different groups. Um, I am the CEO of a company called BarCrowd, and we are doing specifically for law professors. We're working with curriculum design, building learning outcomes and assessment planning, multiple choice writing seminars and editing services, and we have some software of our own under development that is a crowdsourced teaching and learning platform specifically for formative use. If you're interested in talking to us more about any of those things, I will have a bit of, I'll have my email address at the very end of the presentation so you can get in touch with me. And somebody asked me last time for some good resources, and these are the ones I came up with. And I will put these up again at the end of the webinar today, so you don't have to worry about getting them all down right now if you're interested. Understanding by Design is a great book that walks you through a curriculum development in the so-called backward design methods. So you start with what you want your students to know and be able to do, and go backwards through assessment planning and question writing and whatnot. Developing high quality multiple choice questions is an old Journal of Legal Education article that I wrote with my mentor, Susan Case, and a relatively new book that's out, Developing and Validating Multiple Choice Test Items. It's rather a long tome of a book, but it's really good, and that is, I think, from 2012, so it's pretty new. And last, but definitely not least, one of my favorite go-to references, which might seem strange. I'm an attorney and I've worked in the law most of my career, but there's a great book by Susan Case and David Swanson. It's available for free download from the National Board of Medical Examiners, Constructing Written Test Questions for the Basic and Clinical Sciences. And although most of those, all of the examples of test questions used in that book are obviously from the clinical sciences, all of the principles are really, I think, applicable across different areas. And as I said, I've probably read that book 20 times, and every time I go back to it and see something new. So I really highly recommend that. When we talk about question types, I think it's important to start with the idea of answering approaches. And you can imagine that across students, there are hundreds of strategic approaches that they take to answering a question, whether it's a multiple choice question or a constructed response question. But if you think at a very high level, there are only really two big approaches that I recommend thinking about when you are writing in the multiple choice area, when you're doing selected response questions. And you as a professor should dictate in your test instructions which approach is expected for each group of questions that you're giving. There's a best answer approach, which tells students to choose the best response, or sometimes responses, but you should be giving them direction as to exactly how many responses should be selected. Usually we talk about one best answer questions. Those are sort of the classic best answer questions. I've never worked with them, but I do understand that there's, you could say pick two of each group of possible answer choices, and those would still be best answer questions. On the other hand, true-false questions, you're really asking your students to do something different. You're asking them to verify the accuracy of every single response, and there's no direction whatsoever from the professor as to how many responses are going to be true. And at the high level, you want to do best answer questions, not true false style questions. And for those of you who are just getting started writing multiple choice questions, then I think just start with the tried and true one best answer questions. If you have used a lot of multiple choice questions in the past and you have found some questions in the true false area to work for you, I'm not suggesting here that every true false question ever written is terrible, but by and large, when you study the performance of questions across these two big areas, true false questions run into a lot more problems with your students, and I would therefore recommend focusing all your attention on best answer. And lest you think that the webinar is now over and you can sign off, it can be kind of hard to tell the difference sometimes between best answer questions and true false questions. Here's a classic one best answer question. You don't have to read it all the way through. We call this a standard A-type item because it has a set of facts. It has a prompt, which is the call of the question, and it has several different answer options. And in this case, the question is, what measure of damages is the patient likely to recover in a breach of contract action? And this is the classic hairy hand case. There's only really one correct answer here. All of the other answers are incorrect, or you could imagine false, right? There's only one true correct answer. But from the student's perspective in how they're approaching those options, they are not separately judging each and every single option as either to verify the truth of it or determine that it's false, but they're actually finding the best option available, and the test instructions should indicate as much. Sometimes a one best answer question is a little bit easier to pick out as one best answer because the call of the question, the prompt, will say, use some kind of superlative here. What is the most important information? What is the strongest argument? Something along those lines. It's a little bit more obvious to the student what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to approach the different choices you've given them. And one best answer options can always be placed along a single logical continuum if the question is well written. And obviously those options should be responsive to the prompt. They could be, all of the options could be wrong except for the one correct answer, which would be the key. But you can also have one best answer questions where the options are basically sortable from least correct to most correct. And in this case, the wrong answers need not be entirely false. But if you were to ask experts in the field, they should all agree that the correct answer is the best of the stated alternatives. And here's a one best answer fail, which violates the principle that I just laid out, where all of the options are on the same continuum. Which statement most accurately describes the party's legal situation? If you look at A, B, and C, all of those responses are focused on whether an offer was made and accepted, whereas D and E are at a higher level, focusing on whether there's a contract or not. When you have options that respond to the prompt at different levels or on different continuums, you're going to often run into situations where you have overlap. For instance, an examinee here could think both C and D were true or correct choices, and you're starting to get into an almost a true-false type approach to this question. You can also have situations where it's simply impossible to respond if experts would differ because you're talking about apples versus oranges. This situation, you have sort of D and E at a higher level than A, B, and C. So we're talking more about an overlap problem, and we talked a lot about overlaps in the last webinar. This is one variety. But you can also have situations. Let's see, if I go back to this question, what is the most important information to verify before advising the client on this issue? If you've written your options in such a way that expert practitioners in this area would disagree about what the most important thing to verify first would be, because they all make strategic choices about advising their client, which are all, equally valid for them. That's another way that you can get into trouble, because your options in the one best answer format have fallen along different continuums and are no longer comparable. The key attribute of one best answer is basically that the test creator is giving herself some wiggle room. So for any given question, experts or even students could imagine ways that maybe they would have reworded the key, or ways that the wording of the whole question could be improved. But the best answer, everyone would still agree, the best answer is still the best of the stated alternatives. So here's a couple of varieties on that A-type question in the best answer family that work just fine, and you can feel free to experiment with these. R-type items is where you have a whole set of questions that share the same prompt and list of options. So in this case, the prompt could be, for each of the following scenarios, select the objection most likely to be sustained. And then you can have all, as long a list as you like with all of the different objections. This prompt and set of options would remain the same, and you'd have a whole number of fact patterns following. And then for each fact pattern, one of these options is going to be the best answer. Clusters or item sets, it refers to a set of questions that share the same facts. So instead of sharing the same prompt and options, now you've got a group of questions that are sharing the same fact patterns. So you can imagine distributing a case to your students and with the instructions to read the case and then respond to a number of questions about that same case. A couple of cautions for R types and clusters, although they tend to perform as well as A types. There may be a bit of a practical problem for you. One of the advantages, we talked about multiple choice testing as opposed to constructed response questions, is that you generally can have so many questions that it's not a big deal if you have to throw one or more question out. And that going forward, you can mix and match multiple choice questions in a way that you can't necessarily do with essays and performance tests and activities that take a longer amount of testing time. So once you start grouping your questions together as R types or clusters, you can imagine some of these advantages might be harder to achieve in practice. And in addition, I'll just throw out real quick, there are some drafting flaws that we hadn't talked about in the second webinar that was focused on A-type questions that are unique to these to question clusters. So if you're interested in using question clusters, by all means contact me and I can give you some more detail on those. So moving into what not to do, my recommendation is to stay away from all the variations on the true-false approach to multiple choice. The key attribute of true-false, unlike with one best answer, is the test creator has given herself absolutely no wiggle room. So she has to be confident that she's already thought of every possible reading of each question and every possible scenario in which the response could be true or false. And for any given question, experts or students could not possibly imagine ways that an intended true response could be false or vice versa. So I'll give you some very simple examples because I think they set up the problems well. In a standard true-false item, you're going to have a list of statements that the student describes as either true or false. And a couple of these have come from my kids. The first one, if you drop the baton during a relay race, you can pick it up again. This is a question my son was given for a track and field test in his PE class. He answered wrong. He answered, he answered incorrectly. He answered true. If you drop the baton during a relay race, you can pick it up again. And he will argue to the end of the world that it's absolutely possible for you to pick up the baton. And the question did not ask about the rules or about whether you would be disqualified. Right? So, I mean, he knows his grammar, but he is one of the least test-wise people in the universe, which is sort of ironic that he's my son, because I beat my head against the wall when he brings home tests like this. You know, he really isn't thinking about the context of the test being given by a PE teacher to test the rules of track and field. You know, he's picking up on something irrelevant to the rules of track and field, and it's dictating his answer for him. So you run into grammar issues. The second one, elephants are large mammals. Oh boy, you run into scale and perspective issues real fast when you use sizing and scale type terms. So elephants are large mammals. Well, it depends on if the student is thinking about whales or thinking about kitty cats, right? The third one, multiple choice test scores are usually more reliable than essay test scores. So there are a couple problems going on here. Whenever you use frequency terms like usually, rarely, frequently, people have a very wide difference in what they think those terms mean. Usually could mean anything from 51% to 95%, depending on the person that you ask. You know, you need to avoid the frequency type terms. But even worse is there are a whole lot of assumptions being made underlying this statement, so that it's really impossible to say it's true or false. I mean, it depends on how many questions are in the tests, how well written are the questions, have they been field tested? You know, just saying across the board that multiple choice test scores are more reliable is building a lot of assumptions into that true false question that are not explicit. And then one last practical problem that applies to stuff like this is you've only got two possible responses in the standard true false setup. So of course you have 50% chance of guessing correctly. Who's most affected by the problems that I just described? Well, depending on which problem we're talking about and the question individually, often you could be challenging really the wrong people for the wrong reasons. You could be challenging the most knowledgeable or imaginative students. You could be challenging the least context savvy or test wise. That's my son. And you could be challenging those who have been burned by poorly worded tests from past instructors. So if you think back to the question here, that first one, if you drop the baton during a relay race, you can pick it up again. Let's imagine the PE teacher who gave this question actually scored it as true. You can pick it up again, because she was trying to be sneaky and clever and tricky and wanted to make sure that students knew the right grammar, even though she's not teaching grammar, she's teaching gym, right? So she's scoring her test based on things that are really irrelevant to the content that she has told the students she is testing. You know, it happens, and unfortunately it happens to a lot of kids, and so you may be stuck with students who are really scrutinizing every single word that you write in a true-false situation because they've been burned in the past. Okay, so but you're law professors, I know, and I mean I know that law professors more than probably any other kind of teacher are really expert wordsmiths. So can you do can you do better than my son's PE teacher in middle school? Yeah, probably you can. Um, and if you are going to test in a true false um, family, you just want to make sure that each statement is entirely true or entirely false. And um, I will throw out a practical problem that you may run into, which is as you are ensuring that each statement is entirely true and entirely false, and you keep adding more and more to your statement to ensure that nobody could be imagining anything outside of what you want them to focus on, um, you may very well end up making the test questions so easy that the answers are just obvious. This frame of a true-false question is actually not too bad. Which of the following are specific intent crimes? Select all that apply. Um, and this is what I call select all that apply questions. You could have many more options here. You could have a few or many. But it works because the answers are so short that students don't start second guessing your wording or finding subtle ambiguities that were not intended. The only problem here is it's going to be hard for you to do this kind of a setup in the true false area that tests anything other than just mere knowledge. So this is a this is a knowledge-based question. You could Google the answer here, right? It's not really testing cognitive skill the way those type A questions with the fact pattern and the prompt and then the best answer group of options. Those can test a little bit higher level, application and critical thinking. So sometimes it's really hard to tell if you're in the true false family or the one best answer family. And you might think that you're writing true false, but really the students actually are responding as though it's a one best answer, which is again why it's so important to tell them how they should approach answering your questions. In this case, which of the following accurately states the court's reasoning in Smith versus Jones? You could imagine this being embedded within a true false uh, test, but the students are going to think it's a little odd that there would be more than one accurate statement about the reasoning. So they're going to likely treat this as though you're asking which is the best or most accurate statement, and they're going to select one. If you are trying to test in the true false area and you're really saying which of the following statements accurately reflects the reasoning, select all that apply helps to focus the student that there could be more than one. And again, then you could see this question sort of going either way. So I just want to throw it out there. It's not always obvious to the student how you want them to answer. In the opposite direction, sometimes you think you're writing one best answer questions, but they're really true false variations because you haven't, you're kind of using cheater methods within the questions that allow the student to pick more than one of your responses as being accurate. These are all of the above or none of the above, K-type questions, which I'll show you an example of, and C-type questions. And I'll show you an example of one of those as well. And for each of these three variations, there you have some of the basic true-false problems and a few other problems in addition. All of the above, you can often end up cueing students. So in a situation where the student here knows that C is wrong, they can automatically discount D. All of the above can't be a correct response, right? If they know that one of the other options is incorrect. So really you're giving them a way to eliminate an option without any analysis or content knowledge. You can also get muddy feedback. This is a C-type question. Which crime or crimes, if any? Oh,
I did not. Because I
Sherman on board in the area for
Emily?
53344 to Columbia. 53344 has been with KP 31. Columbia.
Stephanie? Oh,
I got it. I think Stacy had her
okay.
microphone on.
Okay. Which this is a C-type question. Which crime or crimes, if any, did the man commit? Arson only, burglary only, both arson and burglary, neither arson nor burglary. You can see that the options are worded with very short options, so there's not going to be a lot of second guessing of how you've written your responses. But I'll just throw out a practical problem. If you're focusing, if the purpose of your test is to give feedback to the students, and you want to do so with all of our amazing modern technology like ExamSoft or other programs where you can tag certain questions to parts of your syllabus like burglary or arson. You might think that it's clever to do, you get 2 content areas for the cost of 1 question, but it's very hard then to give students feedback. A student who answers this question incorrectly, the computer doesn't know if she's struggling with arson doctrine or burglary doctrine, maybe both. So to really diagnose her need, her learning needs, you would have to go back, look at the question, remember, know what the key is, and then see what her answer was to really know what she's struggling with. So it's just sort of a practical concern. This I'll just say is cruel and unusual, and this is the one type I'll just say, oh my gosh, never use these. These are terrible. And you're right back into guess what teacher is thinking, asking students to keep this many options in mind, right? So if they're going to select A, they have to know that 1 and 2 are correct. But then when they move down to B, now they're thinking about 3 and 4. All of this self-reference within the question gets people really caught up in loops, and particularly under exam circumstances where they might be a little bit stressed to begin with. You get into trying to figure out, and of course this is a terrible question as well because it's asking what's important to the defense. Well, that obviously could depend on the circumstances and the strategies of whatever lawyer. And obviously, I mean, I've not put in the facts here of this question, but you could imagine a lot of good lawyers disagreeing about what's important. So you really are asking students to guess what the teacher would say is important. So I call this the stupid says what test, and I've picked on my son a little bit, and he taught me this as well. For anyone who doesn't have a middle schooler, there's a little prank that mine do where they'll come into a room and mumble, "Stupid says what?" And of course, because they're mumbling, I can't hear them, and I always respond, "What?" And then they laugh and laugh because, oh, mom just volunteered herself as stupid by responding what. So it's a little prank that they used to get me on every time. And I think it applies to some of these self-referential type questions. You should read them aloud. If you read a question aloud to an expert in your field, and an expert would say, "What?" That's probably a good sign that you can edit this and make it into a simpler, more straightforward question using standard English. The K-type questions fail the stupid says what test every time, as do, here's one more type for you, an E-type, where you have an assertion and a reason. The assertion here is the majority opinion in Smith versus Jones would be overruled by today's Supreme Court. And the reason is the balancing test applied by the Smith versus Jones majority fails to give sufficient weight, etc. And then your options are different combinations of which one is true, which one is false. If they're both true, does the reason adequately explain the assertion, or are they unrelated? And again, if you ask this of an expert, they're probably not going to completely follow you by the time you get done reading E. They're going to say, what? And you can fix these. That last one, you can imagine handing out the Smith versus Jones case, a series of questions about it, one of which could be, would today's it's going to be a much more straightforward way to ask the question in the one best answer format, where if you read it aloud, an expert is going to be able to follow you, understand what you're saying, and likely answer the question first time out. So here's a little summary. Whoops. And I got a little formatting issue there on my slide. I apologize for that. The one best answer questions, standard A types, facts, prompt, and options are all in A types. And I think there's supposed to be a box there that just refers you back to the second webinar if you would like some tips on how to draft those. R types are the questions with the shared prompt and options, and then you have cluster sets that have shared facts. All of those have been found to perform very well. In the true-false family, these are all the kinds of questions you would be best to avoid. So the standalone statements that students must judge as true or false. Select all that apply, and there's supposed to be a box there that suggests that these are okay if they're using very short options. C types, the A, B, both, or neither construction of the options. Those might also be okay in some contexts. It's hard to diagnose student misunderstandings, though, especially if you're using technology that's sort of working in the background to give your students feedback automatically. And then all or none of the above, K types, E types, all of those are variations on true false in which the students are separately judging the validity of each and every response that you're giving them. And I recommend that you avoid those. I promised you those resources again, so here they are. My favorites are the first one and the last one. Especially that last one is, although it's in the clinical science, is really good stuff. And then there's my email address for anybody who's interested in asking me more specific questions about the exams that you're using or the questions you're writing. I'd love to hear from you. And thanks everyone for sticking with me.
Thanks so much, Beth. Really appreciate it. Just as a reminder, we're going to go ahead and open up our questions period of the presentation. So if you do have a question, go ahead and take this opportunity to type it into the questions area of the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll go ahead and read them out and have Beth answer as many as we can get to in the time that we have left. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. The first question we have, Beth, is, you mentioned the first category works better. Do you mean it works better in discriminating the good from the bad students?
Yes, that's exactly right. So experts who have worked with professors and with, in particular, the National Board of Medical Examiners has done a lot of research into which questions give you the most bang for your buck. And I do mean which questions are better able to discern or discriminate the top performing, most knowledgeable students from the least knowledgeable students. So you're really just getting, if you only have so much time to write questions, the idea is you focus on the questions that are just proven winners that are going to work a lot more frequently than the questions in the true-false family that tend to trip people up at a higher rate for the wrong reasons, right? You know, for reasons that add irrelevant difficulty to the questions.
Great, thank you. Next question we have is, would true-false questions work well for early formative assessments where students are being asked to simply identify correct rules and articulations of the law?
Well, again, it depends on making sure that those statements are 100% true or 100% false in every possible scenario that your students might imagine. I'm not sure I guess I wouldn't necessarily distinguish between formative and summative. I guess I would just say no matter what use you're making of scores, whether you're using scores only to give feedback or, assess the curriculum, or whether you're using scores to assign grades, you're going to want to make sure that the answers are giving you the right feedback and they're not being skewed for students who are answering incorrectly for reasons that aren't really relevant to what you're trying to test, because they're over-analyzing the grammar you're using, or imagining scenarios that you didn't intend for them to think about. So, I mean, you could certainly try some true-false questions on a group of students and then pick their brains and ask them about why they answered true or false for each of them, and see if you feel like your questions are performing adequately, then maybe they are. It's just that overall you're going to run into some students that get tripped up by true false, and then even if you're using them at a very low level for formative use, you might find that the reasons that they missed the questions aren't really tied to their knowledge of what you've been teaching.
Great, thanks. Next question is, I'm having a hard time with other faculty in my program buying into the idea of multiple choice questions or formative exams. Do you have any tips?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I think ExamSoft has the first two webinars available, and that first webinar sort of goes through why I believe multiple choice has a place in law, and a lot of it is related to the lack of formative testing historically among legal educators, and I really think that the tide is starting to turn. I've heard from a lot of faculty members who are interested in doing formative assessment, and honestly, as a practical matter, you're going to be stuck with some sort of selected response questions if you want to go down the road of formative assessment, simply because law faculty aren't going to have the time to continually grade essays every week, right? Or other kinds of simulations or performance tests with constructed responses. So I guess it's a practical matter first of all, but the other main reason is because you're really going to increase the reliable ranking of your students when you do end up handing out grades at the end of the semester. If you've done a lot of testing, you're going to have a better confidence that you're ranking the students well, and that is important because their grades, and at least in the first year, my belief is those are pretty high stakes tests, and if you're only using a few essays, and that is going to determine students' externships, that's going to determine students' law review and moot court participation, etc. I imagine I'm mostly preaching to the choir. If you're here, you're already interested, but so I guess it's the reliability of the scores, and then just the practical ability to do the formative assessment regularly without breaking the backs of the faculty. Oh, I was going to say though, if ExamSoft does have those webinars available still, that first one is really a much longer explanation of what I just said, so you can look it up.
Thanks, Beth. And I was also going to mention that BarCrowd has several really amazing videos on their site as well. If you're needing to maybe persuade others within your program of the merits of using formative assessment, they have a couple of really great videos that kind of explain it as well. We've got one more question, so I'm going to go ahead and close out questions now. If you do have any more, go ahead and post them now as your last opportunity. Last question that I have at this point is, what are some of the biggest tells or indication that a question is or is not valid other than reading it out loud to one of your peers?
Well, I think the biggest issue for validity is, you know, well, you have to think about what is your purpose. Your purpose, if you're in law, ultimately, I guess, is to produce students who are going to be capable attorneys. So if you are asking questions, and that might have, you might have a slightly more focused purpose for your individual class, okay? But if you're asking questions that are basically irrelevant to beginning practice of law, because they would either they'd never come up, or because a new lawyer would never be expected to answer a question like that, or would never deal with a kind of matter that you're asking, because it's at a much higher level than a new attorney would deal with, then I think you've got some higher level validity issues. You're basically, I mean, you can imagine sitting students down and accidentally handing out the wrong test. So you teach 2 courses and you accidentally give one set of students the exam that was intended for the other set of students. You might end up actually ranking the students pretty closely because maybe there's a lot of correlation between the 2 courses. But nobody would say that that's, valid to use the scores from, a real property exam to give students grades in torts or whatever, So I think the biggest validity issue is simply, a reality check. Is this something that's important to the practice of law?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Beth, for your presentation. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here today. As another reminder, yes, this webinar has been recorded. Yes, we will be sending out the link to this recording in the next couple of days, so make sure you're checking your inboxes. I hope everybody has a really great afternoon. Thank you again for being here, and thank you, Beth, for your presentation.